The next speaker, Wieteke Willemen, is professor at the University of Twente and in fact is a specialist on the remote sensing, but also a specialist on how you use it. And not only on the biodiversity side, but also on ecosystem services and those kind of things. So Wieteke has also taken part, for example, in the IBES assessments. Hey, you know IBES? Yes? No? IBES is the Intergovernmental Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So IBES is the panel that makes the reports about how the state of biodiversity and the state of these services. So it's very cool that you're here, Wieteke. Thank you very much for coming, and we'll listen to your talk about biodiversity in our daily lives.
Correct, thanks. I'm starting up my laptop. That's still a bit of a after lunch dip, so to see.
Biodiversity is easy, but it's more difficult. But it's coming, isn't it? Yeah.
At least it says welcome to me. So.
Now it has to say welcome to us, and
yeah,
then.
There we go. I can see something. Let me see.
Yeah, it's coming.
Wonderful. Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today and to talk about biodiversity in our daily lives. You might have seen the RISE website. It has this very prominent and, I believe, quite striking sentence right there. It says the loss of biodiversity is one of the chief threats to humanity's survival. And it's about that link, about biodiversity and human life, that I will be, and how to measure and to describe that link, that's what I will be talking about today, here in Leiden in March 2022. However, that link has been captured and described already for thousands of years. People have been depicting why nature is valued in their society for survival way before there were books or PowerPoint presentations. But also people have been depicting how nature inspired and moved us by its mystical value, for instance. Or people have been showing like how people have been living and working with nature. It was actually quite an important theme by Van Gogh. And yes, so nature continues actually to play this key role for us, even in our modern lives. And that role between biodiversity and what it means to us, that's actually what I, as a scientist, like to capture and understand. First, a bit in a nutshell. Well, most of us know that nature largely determines our well-being. We want to breathe clean air, and we don't want to worry about a drought or flooding, or we want to have food and we want to have building materials. But also nature gives us a sense of belonging or appreciation or relaxation. And these contributions from nature to our well-being, those are commonly referred to as ecosystem services. Koos already mentioned them. But as we know, nature as a life supporter to us is under pressure. Many of us have heard those numbers. The extent of nature is decreasing by 4% every 10 years, and an estimated 1 million plant and animal species are threatened with extinction. And that loss of nature is mostly due to the choices that we as humans make, in which nature often draws the shortest straw. And for example, like plant and animal species, they need to make way for new buildings, for large agricultural fields, and many of the species cannot survive due to pollution. And that is, of course, pretty bad news for nature, but it's certainly bad news for us because we need that nature. well, it's clear that people and nature, so they influence each other, and that's what we call a socio-ecological system. And to better understand that system, when I look at nature, I translate the species and that ecosystem that they form, I translate that to what they mean to humans. So when I look at nature, from that perspective, I see food, I see a natural air conditioner, I see a place to relax. Now, some of those benefits from nature, they cannot be stored or transported. Or actually, well, they can be stored and transported. You actually don't have to be there to enjoy those benefits. While you can move timber and water around, some of the other benefits cannot be stored or moved because you really have to be there, right now to enjoy those benefits, like for crop pollination or enjoying nature. You cannot do that from a distance. And let that actually be my first takeaway message for today. Yes, we need nature, but those benefits that we are getting from nature, that really depends on the place and the moment that we're getting. In this talk, I will take you to 2 different landscapes, where we specifically looked at how, where, and when this irreplaceable, non-movable nature contributes to our human well-being. For these examples, I will take you abroad. The place I work, the Faculty of Geoinformation, Science and Earth Observation, is one of the 7 international capacity building institutes here in the Netherlands that are linked to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So that means that the majority of the work that we do, they link to the themes and the partner countries of that specific ministry. For instance, food security and Ethiopia. More about that now. Here, in the tropical highlands of northern Ethiopia, you can find a very unique landscape. Scattered over this landscape, over this agricultural area, thousands of small islands with dense, old Afro-montane forest patches can be found. These are church forests. And while the rest of that landscape there turned into agricultural fields and settlements, these Ethiopian church forests, they have been preserved for centuries by the local communities for their cultural and religious importance. The people in the region here, they largely depend on agriculture. They grow many cereals, but also pulses and fruit trees and coffee. But the latter, they need pollinators. Or these crops need pollinators, or maybe better said, the farmers, they need pollinators to reduce the risk of harvest losses, and as such posing a risk on the food and income security. In this area, we specifically looked at 4 different crops: horse beans, field peas, mangoes, and coffee. And these are 4 crops that are important because of their nutritious or their market value for this area. And without the pollinators, harvest degrees up to 90% would take place. So our question here was, how do farmers in this area benefit from those church forests? Team of field ecologists, led by Tegenemola Sitota, they visited a large number of these church forests, and they made an inventory of the different trees in those forests and the pollinator nests. You can see here that's a trunk of a tree. It's a bit hard to see, but that's one of those natural nests of pollinators. And they visited a number of the surrounding crop fields in the flowering period. And let me zoom out there a tiny bit. So here you have that church forest with the surrounding agricultural fields. So what the team did is they sat down and measured for around 70 plots. They measured the crop flower visitation by pollinators at different distances from that church forest, up to 1.5 kilometers. And they found a clear pattern. The closer by the church forests, the more pollinator visits they counted, and especially for mango and coffee plots. This supported our hypothesis that these church forests do not only have a spiritual benefit, but they also support the production of crops in their surroundings. And besides this relation, we also saw that the larger, the older, and the more diverse those church forests were, the more pollinator visits we found in the surrounding fields. So we see that there is a link between the location of those pollinators on the crops and also the location of those church forests as a primary habitat of those pollinators. But is this link, is that stable over time? What about seasonality? When we started to check the flowering moment of these trees in the church forests, we noticed that most of them flower in the dry season, starting in October. The crop flower season is just a bit before that, starting in June, July. That means that this timing actually is beneficial for both the farmers and the pollinators. So the pollinators are actually drawn to the crop fields because other pollen sources, at that moment, other pollen sources have become scarce. And for the pollinators, they actually have quite a stable supply of sources of flowering plants in their vicinity. About 28% of the crop fields in this area, they fall within this 1.5 kilometer range of pollinators. Around 28% of the crop areas have an expected benefit from those church forests in terms of food and livelihood security. That's what I wanted to show you about biodiversity and human well-being in Ethiopia. Next thing I wanted to tell you about is, so we can capture that relationship, biodiversity, human well-being in different ways, but everything is changing continuously. And also those contributions we are getting from nature, that is also changing. But how can we keep track of those changes, the way and the way that biodiversity plays a role in our lives? Well, that keeping track of change, that is actually a very important part of a lot of international nature policies. Most of them are about change. They are about halting the biodiversity the decline of biodiversity, or they are about restoring or improving the state of nature and the benefits they provide to nature, to humans. For instance, and like Koos already mentioned, one of these IPBES assessments. There was one of the IPBES assessments that was all about change, and it was one that I participated on. It was on the land degradation and restoration. So what we did is we looked at how biodiversity and the ecosystem services were changing all across the globe in terms of degradation, but we also specifically looked at restoration, again, a change. So how would things increase, how would ecosystem services and biodiversity increase over time? But then again, so when we're talking about change, then the question arises, what is it that you are comparing it with? So is that compared to a moment like yesterday, or is that compared to the start of the Industrial Revolution, or was it the situation before that humans were actually strolling around here on planet Earth? Well, that reference point is actually is key, especially when you talk about policy and action, because that reference point that determines our perception of degradation, but it also helps us thinking about the causes of degradation or restoration as such. And this point, actually, this reference point, was one of the things that was heavily discussed in the assessment that I took place in. But this is again then, this is also my second point, something I wanted to say, your takeaway message. So this temporal information about biodiversity and how it contributes to our human well-being is key. It helps us to make statements of trends, how things are changing, and it can help us to guide actions for restoration. So, key. But Okay, so we want to keep track of changes, but how do we do that? And I know that today is a lot about monitoring of biodiversity, but I would like to talk a bit about how we keep track of not just of biodiversity, but also of those benefits biodiversity is providing to us, so the ecosystem services. And to keep track of these changes, there are many different methods that are available. And I group them as kind of a range, like the people perspective way of keeping track of changes up to the tech-driven approaches. So when you think about people-driven ways, you can think about doing, for instance, fact sheets and participatory mapping, really asking people, what does nature mean to you? You can think a bit more about a mix of technology and human perception. There you have the citizen science, where people can use cameras or other small tools in their surroundings to countings, or you can think about social media data analysis. On the other side of that spectrum, you can think about, okay, so the real tech-driven way of monitoring, the sensors that we have and the loggers. And all of these approaches, they have, of course, their pros and their cons. And the choice of your monitoring strategy pretty much depends on how frequently you want to measure things and what the spatial extent is. But what all those monitoring tools and approaches have in common is that they are prone to bias and error. You want to so when you're keeping track of things, you make a comparison. And what is that comparison? When you make that comparison, what are you seeing when there is a difference, for instance? So here, this little picture. So you can see a difference between the two. You've all been trained when you were 4, 5, 6 years old to spot the differences, right? So there is a difference. The second moment, the tree has apples. Well, is that because indeed the tree started that the change has taken place? But you can also see that a cat and a dog, did a cat become a dog, or was that a misclassification? So when you're collecting data to make statements about change, you have to be extremely aware of the potential bias and error that is included. And that is something that especially the research community has a role to play in. We need to be, of course, we need to share and store our observations on ecosystem services and biodiversity, but these need to come then with an uncertainty statement in such a way that we can actually know that we can take into account this bias or this error when we are making statements about change. I want to take you to the second landscape, where we actually try to implement some of these tools to keep track of change in an area. And for that, I'm going to take you to South Africa, to the Baviaanskloof. This is a dryland area that is valued for its agriculture, its endemic plants and animal species, and for its tourism. And in this area, for decades, this area has been overgrazed. And the result was a heavily degraded rural area. And to turn the tide, communities, together with the NGOs, Grounded, Living Land, and Common Land, they implemented a number of interventions to restore the landscape, to change the landscape. So what they did is they in the past years, so starting in around 1990, a number of interventions were implemented. For instance, a revegetation of areas with a native tree, the spekboom. Livestock was excluded in some areas, and farmers, they moved from low impact, from keeping goats and sheep that were overgrazing the area, to a more low-impact type of agriculture, growing herbs to extract the essential oils from. The intention of the people that lived in this area, or that are living in this area, was that these interventions should actually lead to an increase of these 6 different ecosystem services, or these 6 different ways that nature is helping them to live well. So back to my main question. So how can we then how can we keep track of changes that this restoration activity actually had this effect that people were aiming for these 6 different ecosystem services. For that, we used satellite images. I already mentioned that that when you want to make comparisons, you have to be aware that the way you look at a site, that you do that in the same way, because otherwise a comparison might not be valid. You want to have a standardized approach to do your measurements. Satellites, they are like a number of satellites, they are orbiting Earth, and they are specifically designed to capture this reflection of vegetation and other land covers a couple of times per month, but always in a standardized way. That sensor doesn't change. And that reflection that you are getting from the Earth, either visible or invisible to the human eye, what does that actually mean then in terms of ecosystem service? Can we make a statement like of what the satellites are capturing? How does that translate to these ecosystem services that we want to experience here on Earth? And that's something that needs to be tested and calibrated. So again, we went to the fields, set out our plots, and we started measuring those 6 different ecosystem services in the field. And with that information, we looked at what elements of those satellite images best captured these ecosystem services. So that's what we did. So we tried to fit a lot of models to capture what we measured on the field. And what we noticed pretty quickly is that actually not all of those ecosystem services were easily captured with these satellite images. It was specifically the service that was provided by vegetation to prevent erosion and forage availability for wildlife and livestock. That was something that we could capture pretty well. But this is also another take-home message actually for you today. I believe we have to do a way better job in testing a lot of these monitoring indicators, not just what we can capture, but also what are we missing out upon. So what can we measure, but also what can't we measure in a way over time. But yes, so that's what we did. So we were able to find this relationship between the images and what we saw on the ground. And that is nice if you want to start using that information. So we have that model, but we were interested in that change, like I said. So with what we did is we dove into the image archives, so we could travel back into time up to 1990, and we used that algorithm, that formula that we found to actually make statements about the situation in the past using these satellite images. You get a very nice time series, how things have been changing there. And then what? So we see that. We can see those changes over time. Well, for us, it was interesting to also then to use that information, the temporal information, to say something about those restoration sites, because there was really an attempt of these people of the groups in the area to change things. So what we did is, things are moving faster than I am. Okay, so what we wanted to do is, this is the area again, and the different colors show the different intervention sites. So what we did is, for each of the pixels on this in this map, we knew how many ecosystem services were provided, and we were interested to see if that was actually different compared to the sites that were non-intervened. But so that's what we did. So we measured in the field where things had been, what the situation was of the control and impact. Sorry, there's a lot of things changing here. I'm sorry for that. So the intervened site and the non-intervened sites, but also before and after that intervention. So that's why we started to compare the different locations. And what is important to realize here is that when you want to say, okay, my restored site did better than my non-restored site, you want to make sure that when you do that comparison that you have a similar baseline situation in mind. You want to only compare sites that had already a similar degradation state before that intervention took place. And that is also something we could do using those satellite images, that we already could see what the state was before. So when we started to compare locations, we knew we were doing a fair comparison, that we were not already comparing very lush locations with the more degraded state locations. So this is an example of what you can do if you have this temporal information at your hand. That tells you something about the state of nature and the benefits it provides. So, very briefly, one of the output maps to give you an idea is, again, the same area. And here you can see for each of those pixels that we tested, whether or not the restoration effect was actually positive or that a very little effect was measured. So in green were the sites that actually improved compared to the non-restored sites, whereas the purple sites, not a very clear or maybe even a negative effect was measured. Interesting here to see is that once you start restoring an area or once you are changing an area, how successful you are, that very much depends also on the site itself. So when you have a plot and you change that, also within one plot, for instance, the one on top there, you see that there is a lot of there is a lot of variation within one restoration site. The other thing that you can do once you have this information at hand, you can also try to learn from what you have done. So we looked at why were some locations more successful in that positive change compared to other locations. And there we saw that, for instance, obviously the degradation state really determined how successful a restoration was, but also the soil type or the aspect, meaning, so was it a north or south facing slope, determined how strong that restoration effect was. This is interesting. Okay. Okay, let's go with this. This is a beautiful, imagine here the screenshot of the Arise website where it says, so humanity needs nature. That's what this top picture tells us. And now I'm gonna make a nice round story. That's what I'm doing here. So going back to that first slide where we saw that we need that that humanity needs nature. I want to say, indeed, that's true. Yes, we need nature, and that loss of biodiversity is indeed posing a serious threat on our survival. But in order to make then more informed decisions on how we shape our surroundings and how we shape the future, I have these 4 points that I brought up during this presentation for you to share again. So we need to be aware that these benefits we're getting from nature, not all of them can be stored, transported, and so on. You have to be there at the same place, same time, in order to benefit from them. And these space-time linkages, they need to be captured when we're trying to understand and we're trying to preserve or to improve nature for biodiversity, but also for the benefits of people. Secondly, so when we monitor areas, we want to make sure that we capture the time that is relevant for action. And with that information, we can actually make statements about the trends. Not only the negative, that is going bad with nature, but we can also make statements about what is working well. We can learn from that. We can learn from those successes, and we can help with that information that can support investments in nature or funding accounting. And as a third point, so yes, there are diverse ways of monitoring biodiversity and there are diverse ways of monitoring ecosystem services. And that diverse monitoring data, I believe, is needed. It gives us different perceptions and different angles of what is living around us and what that means for us. There is no one size fits all. But especially but biodiversity data or monitoring data are still very scattered and poorly documented. I really am happy with this crowd, and I hope also other research communities are making a better effort to store and share information on biodiversity and the benefits it provides to nature, to make them findable, accessible, reusable. And there are, of course, initiatives on its way. The environmental accounting is there. The essential biodiversity and ecosystem service variables are there. So the initiatives are there. And I'm glad that an infrastructure like ARISE could facilitate that interaction even further. And as a last point here, something I also hope that you took out of the examples that I showed you, yes, information like monitoring information and sensor information is great for monitoring. It's frequent, it's standardized. Remote sensing data is globally available, but we need to really test and understand well what those information sources are telling us. So what are we missing out on, and what does it mean to our research? And obviously, and then lastly, one of the final points is that this is not something we can do alone. This is something you need partnerships and alliances for. We need to share the data, we need to share our experiences, we need to bring the different angles of looking into this together and join forces. Hey, this one works. But above all, I believe that is key to get this message also across outside of this room. That all of us here on planet Earth, that realize that our existence and our happiness, that really depends on nature. And then I don't mean all the large parks, the protected areas, but also we need to treat all the small things that live around us with care. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. We have time for 1 or 2 questions. Ik hou hem vast.
That's a very good idea. Thank you very much for your very nice talk. When I talk to friends, I always say we need biodiversity for humanity, and they say, yeah, fine. We need some biodiversity, but we don't need all of it. We don't need all the specialized grassland habitats and all that. Do you get that question? And if so, what is your answer?
I do get that question. First of all, the thing is that we don't know what nature does to us. There's a lot of things that we don't know. Of course, we can say, yeah, we can only focus on the things that we know, but we also know that we don't have a perfect knowledge of our living environment. And the other thing I want to say about this is that, so when I talk about the value of nature, so you are specific about human survival. So, but I'm actually taking it a bit broader. I talk about the value of nature, and that one of those values that could be indeed it supports my life, but there's also more to it. There is like an intrinsic value, something that you can say, okay, I want this plant to live because I believe this plant should be here. But it's still my human perspective on the value I put as a human on why this plant should stay there. So that would typically be my answer. It's not just about human survival, it's about valuing the other living.
That's true. And by the way, if you go to the dino room, that's the evidence that extinction is sometimes a very good thing, because if the T-Rex was still roaming around, we would have very different lives. Now, with extinction is, of course, part of life, but it goes way too fast nowadays. Yes, so one final question. No? Oh, yes.
So, open question. Probably not a good answer anyways, but in view of ARISE, how would you see what needs to be changed, advanced of remote sensing to contribute?
Of remote sensing? Oh, we don't need to change. The world needs to change. No, no. So, but what I definitely see, so what I see that the difference between remote sensing information and perhaps a lot of the sensoring work that is happening within ARISE is this temporal dimension. So with remote sensing, you have literally every 5 days a ESA satellite passing and taking a picture of what's happening here on Earth on the 10-meter resolution. So you have that, so you can really start comparing things in time, and you don't have to do an awful lot for that. A lot of the sensors that are now included in ARISE, that is maybe that those it's not super feasible to have that spatial resolution there. What interests me is to see, like, to start combining those layers. So you have your feet on the ground, and there's this high, a lot of details you're getting with your sensors on the ground. So how is there a way to start translating what you're seeing on the ground with this maybe a coarser spatial resolution, but a higher temporal resolution, to really start comparing and looking for those synergies there. And to do that well, you need a proper infrastructure for that. And I guess that was also mentioned earlier today, this really that things can be linked to each other, that you know what the data is coming from, what moment in time it represents. That needs to be very well documented and communicated and be made transparent to be able to use.
At least we pretend to build a good infrastructure to do all that, also including sensing whole landscape. So I guess if we do a good job, your students in the future don't need to travel to South Africa or Ethiopia again anymore.
Oh, don't tell them.
Because no, I know. Because they can get the remote sensing data, but they can also get the sensed landscape data from the web, from the cloud.
Yeah.
Scary thought. Scary thought, isn't it?
No, yeah, it's not. The good thing is that when my students are out, they are measuring while the satellite is passing. So we know that what we are doing can directly be linked to that moment.
Okay.
But of course, yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Good. Thank you very much.